Dubrow Suspicion Files.
Let's talk about time, not in some deep philosophical way. No, we're going to talk about a very real, very specific day in history when railroads didn't just manage time, they literally hijacked it. It's a chaotic and, believe it or not, a surprisingly deadly story about how all of us ended up living by the clock.
Right? How on earth is that even possible? It sounds like a paradox, but on November 18, 1883, it actually happened. In cities all across the United States, church bells rang for noon. And then, just a handful of minutes later, they rang for noon all over again. This wasn't some strange miracle, it was a corporate takeover of time itself.
To get this, you really have to imagine a completely different America. Before the 1880s, we didn't really keep time, we just observed it. Noon was simply when the sun was at its highest point in the sky, right where you were standing. Every town had its own time. Sounds kind of quaint, right? And it was, until the trains showed up and completely broke everything.
And I want you to really get the scale of this problem. It was staggering. We're not talking about a few different time zones. America was running on over 300 different local sun times. It was madness. Wisconsin alone had 38 different local times. Indiana had 23. Just pure, unadulterated chaos.
So think about this. When it was exactly noon in Chicago, it was already 7 minutes past noon in Indianapolis. But in St. Louis, it was still 10 till. Can you even picture the train stations? They must have been a nightmare. Just walls covered in clocks, all showing different times. A short trip could literally send you backwards in time.
But here's the thing. This wasn't just about being annoyed or missing your connection. This chaos had life or death consequences. Because for the railroads, there was a new Bible, a sacred document, the timetable. And that timetable demanded a level of precision that the world simply wasn't ready for.
Just look at the Valley Falls crash in 1853. A train conductor needed 5 minutes to get his train onto a safe siding. He checks his watch, sees he has 4 minutes. Close enough, he figures. Let's go. But he was tragically wrong. A head-on collision killed 14 people, all because of a tiny 1-minute difference between his watch and the official timetable.
So you can see something had to give. The railroads knew they had to act. But let's be really clear about something. This wasn't about public service. It wasn't even just about safety. The creation of standard time was a straight-up corporate power play, and it was born out of fear.
And what's wild is that the idea for time zones had been floating around for a while. A school principal named Charles Dowd proposed it way back in 1870. But, he was an outsider, so the railroads just blew him off. The idea only started to stick when one of their own guys, the ultimate insider, William Allen, championed it. So, the big question is, why then? Why the sudden change of heart? Well, by the 1880s, other people were catching on. Scientists needed standard time for things like weather forecasting. The railroads saw the writing on the wall. They were terrified that if they didn't create their own system, the government would step in and do it for them, and that might hurt their bottom line. They had to act first.
You heard that right. This was a hostile takeover, a corporate coup to seize control of time itself. So on October 11th, 1883, a bunch of railroad officials, not government officials, mind you, met in Chicago and just decided. They carved the country into 4 neat time zones and set the date for the switch, Sunday, November 18th.
And that brings us to the day itself, the day the clocks were hijacked. And get this, the U.S. government was furious. The Attorney General actually called it illegal. But the railroads, they didn't care one bit. They just barreled ahead with their plan.
In New York City, this whole changeover was a very real, very physical act. At 9 in the morning, a guy named James Hamlet walked into the Western Union building. He went to the city's master clock, reached inside, and physically stopped the pendulum. For a tense 3 minutes and 58 seconds, time literally stood still in New York. Then he set it going again. And just like that, almost 4 minutes of the day were just erased. New York was now on standard time.
For anyone on the street, it must have been so surreal. As the sun hit its peak, the bells at St. Paul's Chapel rang out, just like they always did. That was the old sun time noon. Then, a weird quiet, and 4 minutes later, the bells rang again. That was the noon. That was railroad noon.
And people hated it. The public was outraged. The Indianapolis Sentinel put it perfectly. They said people would now have to eat, sleep, work, and marry by railroad time. They knew exactly what was happening. Corporations were now dictating the very rhythm of their lives.
So, it seems like the railroads won. They forced their time on the whole country, and eventually, everyone got in line. Problem solved. The crashes stopped. Except, that's not what happened. Not at all. The day of two noons, in one very critical way, was a failure.
Because despite the new time zones, despite all the corporate arrogance, the deadly crashes didn't stop. The system had a fatal flaw that nobody saw coming. So why? I mean, they standardized time across the entire country. The map was fixed. What could possibly still be wrong?
The tragic answer came 8 years later in a town called Kipton, Ohio. Two trains on the same track speeding toward each other. Same time zone, synced up timetables, everything should have been fine. The engineer of the passenger train looked at his watch. He thought he had 7 minutes to get his train safely onto his siding. He didn't have 7 minutes. He had 3. His pocket watch had simply stopped for just 4 minutes earlier in the day and then started up again all by itself. A tiny, unnoticeable mechanical failure. The two trains collided head-on. Both engineers died instantly. 9 postal clerks in the mail car burned alive.
The Kipton crash was the final bloody lesson. The day of two noons had standardized the zones, but it hadn't standardized the watches themselves. And that terrible disaster is what led to the real solution, the birth of the world of precision that we all live in now. The railroad companies, completely horrified, appointed a Cleveland jeweler named Webb C. Ball to figure out what happened. His conclusion was simple but profound. The problem wasn't the zones, it was the watches. He realized that for real safety, you needed more than just standard time. You needed standard timepieces.
And this led to something called the railroad grade standard. For the first time ever, a watch had to meet incredibly strict rules to be used on the rails. It had to be accurate to within 30 seconds a week, it had to be inspected all the time, and it was even designed so you couldn't accidentally change the time by bumping it. This was the birth of precision as a system.
So, the day of two noons wasn't the end of the story at all, it was just the beginning. The railroads hijacked the sun, but when that wasn't enough, they had to go one step further and invent precision itself. It's the reason your phone syncs perfectly to an atomic clock, and it's even where we get the phrase, to be on the ball. Because in the end, we all had to get on the train.